inviting me to prompt this discussion. There are many different ways in which Platypus members have presented this teaching, Capital and History. Today I'll be giving a 45-minute lecture, and then we'll move into a free-flowing discussion and question and answer mix. I'll ask you to keep and hold your clarifications, comments, and questions until that discussion so our conversation can be more productive. This presentation aims to open up the question of the left's historical tasks and goals. You should not take anything I say for granted. The thinkers I reference and quote should begin and not end your thinking as to their logic. With that being said, let me reiterate the prompt that you might have seen. Capital and History. What does it mean that Marx and Marxism still appeal while political movements for socialism are weak or non-existent? What were Marxism's original points concerning radical possibilities for freedom that might still appeal to the present? Does Marxism even matter? To begin in the middle of things, why are we the way we are? How can we start to make sense of and change to any ends the present? What is an emancipatory politics, and why does it appeal? Why would anyone today or in the past have thought that Marxism is emancipatory? Perhaps surprisingly and distinctly from left groups, Platypus does not think that one can simply take up an investigation into the supposed material circumstances of the world. Instead, we prompt you to say that we have to begin with the question of how we came to understand our present and to what ends. Perhaps how we perceive the present is best understood through how we perceive history. Human self-transformation through time, what has been possible, desirable, and necessary for human life. History, as in the term in front of you, might encompass questions of social relations, the relations you have to yourself, the relations you have to each other, and the relations you have to nature across a variety of fields as listed there, from artistic to scientific to philosophical and maybe psychological. But to what end? Kant, who faced a similar dilemma in the 18th century, wrote that if history was to be more than the confused play of things human, more than the disconnected effect of lawless freedom, it must be giving a meaning or direction, which would task us to consider the possibilities for the present, for possible emancipation. However, if we take the present view of society at its word, as a constantly shifting battle of unclear political values, we may come to see the history and potential of humanity as passive or stifling, and as Nietzsche says, deadly to life. An account that is simply beyond our comprehension, that is, at most, the history of gang wars and rackets, as Adorno puts it in his reflections on class theory, Marxism. Or, as W.B. Du Bois puts it in Black Reconstruction in America on slavery, paraphrasing Hegel. Without meaning, despite the great abilities of humanity, the suffering of the past would have no bearing on and for the present. Quoting Du Bois, "The most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of the dark beauty of their mother continent into the newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell, and in the 3rd century they arose from the dead, in the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions, which this world had ever seen. It was a tragedy that beggared the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation and the French Revolution. Yet we are blind and led by the blind. We discern in it no part of our labor movement, no part of our industrial triumph, no part of our religious experience. Before the dumb eyes of 10 generations of 10 million children, it is made mockery of and spit upon, a degradation of the eternal mother, a sneer at human effort, with aspiration and art deliberately and elaborately distorted. And why? because in a day when the human mind aspired to a science of human action, a history and psychology of the mighty effort of the mightiest century, we fell under the leadership of those who would compromise with truth in the past to make peace in the present and guide policy in the future. To come to terms with the idea that humanity could have more in store in its future than, to modify Henry Ford, one damn policy after the other, I will introduce the history and the concurrent philosophy of history, which Marxism took for granted, and only later pose what Marxism might have to say beyond it, its critique of that history. The critique being that an emancipatory politics to overcome capitalism would have to prove by its activity that what we call history today, and even its meaning, is a prehistorical and so for us obsolete problem. But history itself was and is a serious problem. The meaning of history was bound up with the bourgeois revolution, which I will detail, and the bourgeois revolutionaries. For them, history could only be the account of the actualization of freedom for the present. What was their account? Living in the wake of the bourgeois revolution of free thinking and free acting mankind, we can imagine the quote-unquote human revolution, the differentiation of the human as a particular sort of animal, our ability to exist as social animals with the ability to reason. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the human initially existed as any other sort of animal, much like how a bear catches fish out of water and laments the death of their young. A human would catch fish with their bare hands and feel suffering for other parts of nature. This historical action went unrecognized at the time, but we might label and feel it today as a crisis of nature. Why are humans not like other animals? What should we take to be the meaning of humanity, now opening its relation to nature? Are we ruining or creating nature? With the course of time, human beings developed a specific form of reason, the ability of and freedom in industry, diligence in creating tools to shape their relationship with nature, rather than submitting to the training of the human body by nature, a net to catch fish. But the ability to reshape natural physical bounds also sparked the reshaping of human relationships and feelings, the creation of hunter-gatherer clans, a supernatural affinity that includes only some. As Rousseau puts it, this freedom and change manifested so that mankind continues to grow tame, contacts expand, and bonds tighten. Humanity takes up the first duties of civility in perfecting itself, and civilization appears not as it does now, as a necessary interchange with all other human beings, but as incidental encounters between distinct groups of humans for natural benefit. From this comes Rousseau's thought experiment of the society of noble savages. For, as Rousseau describes in his discourse on inequality, this vision of hunter-gatherer civilization rests on a knife's edge. The human ability to create new relations between objects and people means that humanity now restrains itself only by its social second nature. The nature of the human being, what it means to be human, becomes open to change by human beings. They now can act in cruelty. Human beings, to remain sociable and kind, now must subordinate and domesticate, or forcibly civilize, and change not only animals, but now post-natural human beings. As Rousseau puts it, equality disappeared, property appeared, work became necessary, and the vast forests changed into smiling fields that had to be watered with the sweat of men, and where slavery and misery were soon seen to sprout and grow together with the harvests. This is a related but separate crisis as we see it now, a crisis of humanity. What could humanity have to do with creating the human? What is human? Are we good or evil to ourselves? Rousseau here marks what we now call the Neolithic or agricultural revolution, the creation of a surplus, production carried on by rote beyond meager subsistence, due to the enslavement of humanity to a division of work. This inaugurates writing and the first truthful accounts of a human time, history. For us, it is the move from pre-agricultural humanity and civilization to traditional civilization and the society of castes. That is, all written history until the very recent, perhaps no later than the 1600s. For Hegel, this is the time of the slaughter bench of history. Those who can control the bodies and routines of others no longer must work. This is the civilizing that apparently tears away the human from the non-human and gives the human responsibilities and rights unto the gods and not nature. Instead of a human place in nature, humans must maintain the humanity into which they are born, their divine status in subordination to other orders or species of humans. As Luis Manon puts it in his introduction to Edmund Wilson's study of the thinking and acting of history to the Finland Station, in pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent, arises from all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. Rousseau's fields stood for millennia, demanding every generation submit itself to the maintenance of the soil and its harvest, and every generation maintain and continue its own elites, the nobles and priests. Work was not done as it is for us good bourgeois subjects to the ends of progressively lessening the burdens of natural and human life, but to remain within the active civilizing process, to remain human and not risk a return to our lingering, unhuman natures. The accumulation of wealth was not proof of work done towards a future end of suffering on earth, but rather, as the New Testament of the Bible says, merely treasure to be stolen by thieves and corrupted by rust. Matthew 6:34, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Humanity, therefore, apparently fell below its ability to work out its relations to nature. From this crisis of human interrelation, how could humanity take these bonds, these irrational obligations between castes, as the possibility for freedom rather than subordination? It was not to be found in the discontented of this traditional society, who did not seek to destroy or equalize human relations, that is, to give up on civilization, as did those who abandoned their humanity and fled for the dark forests of nature, but to recreate the times of greater prosperity, when the castes of rulers were really benevolent and not cruel, so that those in charge would understand their good, true, God-given, and supernatural, not natural, status. For the bourgeois revolutionaries, the task was to grasp this inheritance of humanity, of the process of civilization, of religion, art, culture, and philosophy, as human-directed, and thus rational, that these bloody treasures belong not to the caste of ostensibly superhuman nobility and clergy, and their control of the labor of other human beings, but the human being as such, and its abilities. For the bourgeois thinkers like Mandeville, civilization gives humanity a greater task than that of the bee. It must not only understand and transform its relation to nature as the bee does, but it must understand and transform its relation to itself, as human and as civilized. But where did the ability for this critique arise? How did we start to believe in historical progress and the individual and their rights? How did even the meaning of politics change from the Greek stasis, the lack of change, and bloodshed between intractable factions for control, to now debate, legislation, and change in society? Historically, the end of traditional society appeared for Adam Smith in the world's greatest slave revolt, the fleeing of the peasants after the end of the Western Roman Empire into congregations, the first post-Neolithic, social and not caste-based cities or military cities that were merely extensions of a royal family. From the 1800s to the 1500s, for Adam Smith, these civilized ex-slaves who could turn for their defense to no lord than each other, the figure of human connection for them and daily life became not the underlings of the military warlords of antiquity or the similarly bound peers of your caste, but the shopkeeper and the daily market and its necessary mutual trust in difference from self-interest. But this development of society was perhaps the most peaceable, or in the view of the knights and priests, the most cowardly slave revolt. For these congregations of citizens, city dwellers, burghers, the bourgeois, demanded neither new masters nor to become the new elites, as previous slaves had done, but solely they demanded their own interest. They demanded that they not give up their bodies to their lords, but rather their treasures, the hardware and manufactures they alone could produce. Upon themselves, these citizens placed not the debt of religious virtue, but of wealth, a demand which they could fulfill by paying rent to the lords, a demand fulfilled beyond good and evil, consummated in crime and in virtue. But in separating themselves from divinity, Smith continues, these citizens evaded the crippling subservience that characterized life outside the cities. City air would make you free. To render century-old contracts meaningless by producing wealth, these former slaves worked on themselves. They became more skillful in production. This improvement necessitated commerce not only with the slave lords, but between citizens. In production and all the social forms it required, human beings practically negotiated their relationship with nature, raw material, with each other, trade, and with themselves, skillfulness. One could now also develop the character of their own needs and social bonds through hobbies and civil associations and organizations, and most radically, even free religious practice. You could choose your own gods. As John Locke identified, after realizing the right to property, differentiated people, individuals, could work on the project of their own becoming, the capacity to change oneself in realizing one's own status as an object to be worked on, as nature had been, and also the development of one's abilities to change oneself, in the alternating and productive dialectic of self-objectification and self-subjectification. What was meaningful became what was yet to come, and not what had already been. How could the present clarify itself through practical activity and point towards the future? In thought, critique became the expression of this clarification, such as with Kant and Hegel. Society demanded that this possibility, as the bourgeois revolutionary Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence only 250 years ago, be enshrined as the unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. By the 1600s, this development practically displayed the comedy of prior claims to divine society. Nobles sold their birthright, their connection to God, their control over lands and the attached peasants for common trinkets. Nobles were forced to participate as equals in commercial society with the slaves they had claimed to rule. The ancient nature of politics, the chain of subordination of one to another, could not last. The third estate, the workers, bourgeois society, had, as the Abbé Sieyès put it, even before the French or American Revolution, become everything, precisely in how they demonstrated the superfluousness of politics. Why would you need an agent of God or the government to interact with other human beings to realize your humanity, when you could simply rely on the good sense and practical reason found in any human being? The first and second estates, the nobles and clergy, could no longer wildly claim to descend from the race of the conquerors. We arrive back at Kant, pondering the meaning of civilization, if it is not to become meaningless and merely glittering misery. The point would be to realize the crisis of civilization in that time. How could the process of civilization, of the creation of rents, court dances, and government, be turned to the ongoing task of freedom for the bourgeois revolutionaries, in which all were implicated? At the end of the 18th century, after the English, American, and French revolutions, this seemed to be the endless social task in an apparent end of history, but a beginning for endless reason. How could reason leverage that all humans had become workers and had come into a social contract with each other, separate from, and which could possibly overcome the need for government? As Benjamin Constant wrote in 1820, the demand to assert individual political values over others in the liberty of the ancients had been overcome by the liberty of the moderns, the social multitude of equal influences, or the reality of self-becoming and self-transformation in society. So politics was no longer about regulation, but about the self-development of public opinion through discussion, far more outside of the government than within. Representation in politics was no longer about your individual influence on the tribunal through your selection, but through the exercise of your public reason. Censorship was now a crime against society. This task can appear to us as perpetually unfinished today. What politics can't claim to demand a better understanding of government for the benefit of those who work in society? That is to say, all of us. For Adam Smith, as he recognized in his political economy, that is to say, his politics societyism, morality was social contribution, inevitably arising from not only the workers' activities, but those of the proprietor, stockholder, the landlord, and even the last nobles. Discontents in this form of society, in bourgeois society, when they did not reject the task of freedom, only sought to better understand and apply the modern conditions for a reason. However, that is not our task today. Apparently, reason itself fell into crisis. Why do we have a different project from that of the revolutionaries of the late 18th century? Hegel's hairs split themselves into left and right Hegelians in the 1830s after his death. And in economics, Ricardo's application of Smith's understanding of freedom would be questioned by an ostensible left. In industry, the workers would set themselves apart from the proprietors of stock, from the rest of society, and in the view of the most radical theorists, apparently assert themselves as a monopoly upon labor, simply restricting the free commerce and self-development of society for their particular antisocial interests. Attempts to take up this crisis through the concepts of bourgeois society proved double-faced. The dialectic, humanity acting on itself, appeared to be frozen against itself. If the problem was to be posed again as civilization, as these bourgeois thinkers put it, was the issue that society was too civilized? Was the goal some sort of anarchy? Or was humanity not bound to itself sufficiently? Was the problem to create a totalizing plan of human society, a total social democracy, to surpass existing democracy and republics? Both answers identified a collapse of the possible freedom posed by bourgeois society, but neither could be said to be totally right, and both could be said to be insufficiently enlightened. The issue was not that society, as these bourgeois philosophers identified in reflecting upon themselves, had ceased to exist, but that society now operated to disintegrate itself. One appeared stuck as an object or subject in relation to society, in relation to nature. In all these fields which bourgeois society had in its critical reflection opened up for humanity. Marx, as a young student, before encountering the left explicitly in philosophy, wrote that philosophy surprisingly now appeared as dogma from the outside the world, like the utopias of the socialists, or as a vulgar and mean rationalization of what already was. What did this new social world seem to spontaneously manifest outside of the demand for freedom? There was apparently a new crisis in society, that of society and industry in relation to what was being termed capital, the power of previous labor, embodied most vividly for us in machine production, self-acting mules, self-acting looms, to cause the unemployment, the destruction of present labor. Labor now seemed to outgrow the bounds of individual action, and individual workers became the workers and were assembled by, apparently, the demands of production into their roles in manufacturing. Workers now appeared as a class of people, proletarians, subject to an immiseration for which they could blame no one or everyone equally. In the face of the development of human industry, workers reasserted their bourgeois right to be human, to sell their labor through strikes, sabotage, and economic action against a production that's increasingly seemed to take place against the whims of society. Following the Industrial Revolution, industry itself seemed to leave the human purview. The crisis appeared as humanity's need to coordinate industry to society, or to coordinate society to industry, to subordinate one to the other, a crisis of capitalism. The bourgeois social relations, freedom, appeared untethered from their simultaneous basis and results in industry, the unfathomable increase in the industrial forces of production, neither the abandonment of human possibility, or neither the abandonment of this industrial potential through the image of primitive communism and the end of industry, nor the evisceration of human possibility by an attempt to renounce the formative and continuing bourgeois society and its never-ending revolution could resolve the issue. Politically, the continuing toppling of the elites of society by the left against the right failed to grasp this problem of capital. In the face of this, doctrinaire socialisms and communisms stated their claim to existence and opposed their social problem, politics, to the economic or industrial problem posed by the new unions of proletarians, economy. This was the world which Marx entered in the mid-19th century. It now appeared that bourgeois society had entered not a reconciliation of humanity to freedom, but an eternal war of class against class, where both sides of an unending struggle demanded the same things against each other, from the same history of radical bourgeois thought and the same radical aspirations. Marx's key insight was that this issue pointed to not another act of genesis, similarly to how bourgeois society shook out traditional civilization. It was not the working class creating itself in opposition to the society which created it, but rather a realization, the question of how one could practically realize society's ongoing self-destruction and creation of the unrealized possibilities of overcoming existing society. This potential and destruction was the capital which created for Marx and both created and destroyed the working class in employment and unemployment. How could politics overcome its prehistoric nature, its inability to self-reflect in the face of this crisis? How could it pose this social question? Marx took this question keenly, observing in his response to the socialist Proudhon in 1847 that the trades union, the association, was not just the economic expression of a class divide, nor was it unrelated to the political struggles on the basis of bourgeois society, like those of the Chartists for honesty in government, but that economic association became political for the working class and through its action, and political association became economic. In other words, the working class, through its own activity, could form itself into a reflection of the problem of society, that this reflection of the same problem could be the only means to possibly work through it. The only new thing in society, the only thing that might set it free, would be a further development of society's own tendencies to divide itself into classes. The present, for Marx, termed capitalism, was the historical condition of bourgeois society in crisis. One could not simply reason about the world from any perspective. There was now a social, economic, and political task that transcended any divisions between the disciplines or between classes and enmeshed both capitalists, the people who seemed to rule capital but yet were ruled by it, and the working class, which seemed to be subject to capital, yet could exert itself and actually create this capital, that these new formations were the possibility for change. The rallying cry for Marx to change society would be the emancipation of the working class, not for the sake of the working class's condition in its hellish mills, but as the working class's movement beyond servility, as the only possible indicator of society's ability to emancipate itself, to overcome itself, and to lay rest to society's convulsions against itself, to prove its past merely prehistoric, obsolete. In the Communist Manifesto, in the wake, Marx reiterated these points in the wake of mass starvation and the ongoing changes in the proletarian movement, or as he puts it, the specter of communism. In advance of what might have yet become another repetition of political failure in 1848 and the brewing revolutions, how could that revolution against ostensibly monarchy become political and not outdated, not another French Revolution? Marx put this question at the hands of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The highest problem for a society which could no longer motivate its self-activity would be the direction of society by the working class. As Marx noted in the 1847 Poverty and Philosophy, again responding to Proudhon, the trades union's only meaning was its uselessness for the economic struggle. The ability of the working class to engage in political activity while misrecognizing it as economic activity demanded a critique for Marx of the ends of society that placed this struggle within its historic role. Now, the 1848 revolutions, which spanned all of Europe, seemed to be merely a repetition of the French Revolution. They were posed at the demand for the National Guard, for the reassembly of the people, of the social republic, as the true culmination of the French Revolution. In short, as we might understand it, a demand for the most radical democracy. But for Marx, the meaning of this democracy was not simply the political democracy of the Greeks, an ability to have a democracy against an aristocracy or an oligarchy or a monarchy, but as the possibility for the proletariat to take up its own task of directing society, that this democracy was not to be political, but social. I, unfortunately, cannot recapitulate the history of the 1848 revolutions in full, and everything that follows will be in part sketchy in that sense. But democracy, after the 1848 revolutions, and Marx's pivotal role in attempting to articulate and direct revolutionaries across Europe, apparently succeeds after the most bloody quelching of the working class in history to that point. The Republic, which had deemed to give freedom to all of France's people in France, now apparently had to restrict it against democracy. But for Marx, these Republicans were not the side to be stuck with, nor was the opposition of Bonaparte, who did demand the same democracy. After the failure of society, of bourgeois society, to reconstitute itself in this revolution, that there were no longer the abilities to constitute the nation as such in France, that one could not be French and put that as an answer to what it means to be a worker in modern society. Bonaparte responded, the opposition, apparently as a socialist, that one had to take note of the conflict in society. One simply had to manage it. Bonaparte came to power after standing by the quenching of the working class, apparently on the side of the working class, not as a figure of the proletariat, but apparently in the figure of its reconciliation with capital. Bonaparte, most crucially though, pointed to, for Marx in the 18th Brumaire, reflecting on this productive manifestation of the crisis of society, that society had overcome the need to be bound within the limits of thinking about itself in a bourgeois fashion. That Bonaparte and his apparent dictatorship through democracy of society, his one-man rule, his presidency, and his later ascension to the empire, apparently mimicking that of the earlier French Empire, actually indicated the demand for the only possible political leadership that was not simply giving from one hand, stealing in one hand and giving to the other in society, the leadership of the working class. Bonaparte seemed to profane democracy by giving it its true character, its nihilistic nature in modern society, as simply, apparently, this robbery of society by itself through the government. That on one hand, one must steal from one's fellows so that they simply do not become another proletarian of the Roman era, and not the proletariat as it was for Marx. In similar ways, democracy seems to be taken up today. After that time, Marx continued his attempt to pose a critical recognition of the working class's attempts to forge itself in society. And this appeared to manifest itself not in the First International, which seemed to take up almost a utopian character, despite its heavy interventions in the period, but in the Second International, which posed the creation of a working class as its manifest task. However, this seemed to be taken up as a problem in the early 20th century, that it was not so much the creation of the working class, but its direction, perhaps, in politics. Lenin, for example, in What Is to Be Done, would criticize this attention to society by earlier social democrats and those of his time, when taken up in the early 1900s as merely economism, as a neglect of the social problem, of the tasks of the revolutionary. Since 1917, this problem of how Marxism continues to be a critique of the present for the future, for the task of the future, has only grown more unclear. And the meaning of these debates over Marxism, to which I have referenced following 1848, not only between Marx and the anarchists, and the social democrats and the anarchists, and the sort of, as you might put it, like the Leninists or the revolutionary communists against the social democrats, have become obscure and maybe are taken up in a way that does not clarify but obfuscates the present moment. I think to reflect on that and to reflect on the old left and the new left and all the lefts that have attempted to take up the problem of human emancipation, we need to start by trying to understand what this critique of society meant for Marx. And so I would like to leave you with one quote from Marx. Marx writes in the 18th Brumaire that after the revolutions of 1848, which apparently demanded the success of the working class, and as I said earlier, instead revealed the inadequacy of the working class, but also the incapability, the impossibility of the bourgeois revolution to be more than mean and vulgar and simply theft. Marx wrote, "Society now seems to have fallen back behind its point of departure in the revolution. It has, in truth, first to create for itself the revolutionary point of departure, the situation, the relationships, the conditions under which modern revolution alone becomes serious. The history of Marxism, since Marx wrote those words, apparently have been various ways to make that statement true. But in posing that, in acting on that, they appear to have made those words less distinct for us from the past and all that has come before it. That they do not orient us to what is the present and what could be new in it, but rather demand us relitigate the past unproductively. Thank you.
Should do Q&A now, so
yeah, Q&A is fine.
Questions do people have?
They can also be about the chart. I know there's some terms that I didn't talk about there.
Really quickly, what happened in 1917 and why do you care?
1917, I mean, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say on it, but as I understand it, 1917 is taken up by many left groups today as something to be opposed to or to be in favor of. 1917 referring to the Russian Revolution, and referring especially to, as to the Finland station has it, the possibility for overcoming society in the 20th century as a culmination of Marxism through the figure of Lenin. I think that 1917 poses the question of, most clearly, as a revolution, the nature of this conscious repetition on the part of a Marxist project. Apparently, the Leninists, or the followers of the Bolsheviks in Russia, but also the opposition to the Russian Revolution on the part of the Social Democrats, which Lenin, of course, was once a member. And so, as this question arises, it puts on the table, what is consciousness? What does it mean to be conscious of the present moment? And if that is the issue, why are these conscious critics of the present, these Marxists in 1917, in waging and understanding the Russian Revolution, unaware of, well, how was this actually not a success? Why are we still talking about capitalism today? Do people want to say something about Lenin? I know he's a fairly prominent figure if you're thinking about the left.
You mentioned, I think you were reconstructing something that Smith had said at one point, that the bourgeoisie had instead tried to formate themselves in the economy for their own interests, and not tried to mimic the behaviors of the slavers, or the enslaved people becoming the slavers. Do you not think that it would have been in the interest of do you agree with that? Do you think it's possible that it would have been in the interest of the slaves to have become the enslavers?
I also mentioned this earlier, but what you were saying is, in part, what these previous slave rebellions had wanted. In some cases, it wasn't even for a change in their own masters, but rather for a reallocation of goods. I think whatever we might have to think about Smith, or whether that choice can be undone, I don't think it is undoable today, that we live in the consequences of the decision. I think the key point for Smith, and the key point for Marxism, as a critique of Smith, is how do we not live in that sort of traditional society? What was the actual choice made? It was the choice for humanity to actually reflect on itself. And that's the sort of critical impulse that Marxism maybe tries to undertake today.
But, specifically, do you agree that it was not in the interest of the slaves to become the enslavers?
How do you mean?
Well, objectively, now you get control over this other person who gets to do all your labor for you, those resources are allocated towards you, regardless of whether or not you've established some sort of, communistic society instead of establishing like a slave society, right? At the end of the day, I mean, you can even argue in some respects it might be better if you wanted to just play video games all day or something, right?
I think that also raises the question of like, what, for Adam Smith, of course, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Wealth of Nations, but in the second half of it, he starts describing why is there a difference of wealth between nations? Why is it not just a question of like, wealth is like sort of equidistant across all nations? It becomes, how does the bourgeois revolution actually create wealth as its object? How do people actually start working on themselves to even have hobbies? Before the Xbox, in traditional society, you would have the god that you would choose, and you would escape into a commune, actually. Bourgeois society, or this cowardly society, and as I put it, maybe there isn't even any bravery required for it to take place. Maybe this is a trick of fate. And Nietzsche, I think, talks about this to some length. He's like, well, maybe we are the descendants of slaves. Maybe that's our historical condition. I think in terms of historical self-reflection, we are past that point. I don't know if it's possible to undo it. It has happened. I don't know if I'm getting to your question.
Do you think there's a quantitative difference between my Xbox and God?
I think there's a qualitative difference, but surely there's also a quantitative difference in how much human reflection was required to assemble these parts of whatever hobby device you want. In the way that one's relation to God in traditional society was apparently emanating from your consciousness in a way that's much harder to articulate now.
I mean, maybe this is a bad attempt to help you out, but like, what about the situation of the Spanish versus that of like the English? Like, what about the Spanish who kind of did try to like take over the Americas by just like getting a bunch of gold, getting a bunch of slaves, and that seems to not work out anymore. Like, they just have a bunch of inflation and then they kind of just work their slaves to death. Whereas like the people who are trying to do like mercantilism like actually start succeeding and having wealth. And like Adam Smith has to think that through. Or he's trying to talk about, well, why does someone in our society that seems really poor, like why might they have more wealth than like an African king back in the day? Because they can command the cooperation of so many people to just have these things that seem really impoverished, like their pots and their pans and their coat and stuff, where the African king can only command like 20 people. You have all of society coming together to provide for your needs. But obviously this gets thrown into contradiction with like capitalism. So I don't know how much, but like there was a plausibility to that. Like, it wasn't in your interest to just live as an African king. It wasn't in your interest to just be like the Spanish.
I think it's also key that the question that you raised, which is why can't you just be like a slave lord today, is something that we're thinking about in relation to how we experience the present as capitalism. That you are already subject to the slavery of other people, apparently. But for the bourgeois revolutionaries, this apparent slavery in society, this interdependence, was actually something on which you could reflect on and could actually subjectively manage. That your choice of whether you would go to one bar or another was actually something that you choose, and that actually meant something for society, in a way where today that seems almost random, both for like the proprietor of such an establishment, like you have to become like subservient to the laws of the market, or for the worker in like the stereotypical factory, you seem to be just there to operate the machinery or to operate your fellow men.
What was the primary determinant of that? Do you think that still exists?
Of
the, I guess the propensity towards critical thought, self-actualization, that kind of thing?
I don't know if we can say more than what the bourgeois revolutionaries said, which is it was this civilizing process that humanity, even as it was acting unconsciously for the bourgeois revolutionaries, was actually developing some way of reflecting on itself. That as it was making these court dances and making this music and trying to devote itself to God, what it was actually doing was creating a better way for it to understand itself. That as you develop a court dance, you're actually understanding what are human legs? How do they actually move? And in the same way, that comes out of how does humanity create tools for itself at the most basic level.
Okay. So in the start we have like these different epochs, and then they're prompted, or a revolution is prompted by a crisis. Throughout history we see this pattern. I kind of want to focus in on the crisis of capitalism, I guess, and what you said about the collapse of freedom posed by bourgeois society, creating our task for today. I'd like to maybe get a explanation of what is this collapse of freedom, of this bourgeois freedom? How is it prompted, I guess, by the Industrial Revolution and capitalism? And then, because for me, like what I'm getting stuck at is like the proletariat today are still engaged in fighting for their bourgeois rights. And so I'm like, if we are within this collapse of bourgeois freedom, where this bourgeois framework is no longer supporting what humanity is wanting to become, how is it? It's like I don't know how to describe it. I'm like, we still have to be supported by that bourgeois framework while also trying to overcome it, and that contradiction is where I'm wanting clarification.
Yeah, I think it's a question about history. I'm actually going to sketch the chart that you have in front of you in a second to maybe work through that. But I think it's history in two senses. One in the sense of what has already passed. What is the condition for us to be acting upon emancipation for the present? In that way, it's almost sort of descriptive. In the other sense, it's critical. What is actually possible in the present? What's new about the present? And I think talking about the present as post-bourgeois society means that bourgeois society is in our past and that its tasks remain while not being the main tasks of our present. And I think the timeline, maybe I'll modify it, but I'll redraw it here. I brought up the crisis of nature in the Paleolithic. There's the crisis of humanity with traditional society. There's apparently a crisis of civilization that the bourgeois radicals understood themselves intervening in. And yet, if you look at the chart, it seems that with capital, we're back to a crisis of nature. So how do we make sense of this? And here's how I understand it. As I was sort of laying it out, for the bourgeois think, well, you can think about this firstly as a line, but that's not the most interesting part of it. For the bourgeois thinkers, the meaning of this crisis means that humanity actually has a way of acting upon itself for freedom. That in the Paleolithic, as I was describing, with these clans and this human relationship to nature, this understanding of humanity in nature was actually, for the bourgeois thinkers, something that could advance freedom. And so it appears as a sort of progress, that there was no ability for humanity to reflect upon itself prior to this historical accident. That in the same sense, in traditional society, in developing the good of people, there was similarly another advance, that court dances, because they were, to go back to that example, because they were good, because they were expression of divinity, actually meant something else for the bourgeois radicals, that they were an expression of humanity developing its abilities to act arbitrarily on itself. This arbitrariness actually pointed to the ability of humanity to civilize itself however it chose. That maybe actually even foot binding represented the way that humans could modify themselves to act in relationship to other humans in a way that was profoundly unthinkable in previous epochs. In the crisis of civilization, this was sort of brought to the fore. What do you make of political revolutions? How do you be critical of the French Revolution as someone who's participating in it? How do you be critical of the present in politics, in society? How do you sort of have the possibility of this, maybe to just lean on Kant, like what is pure reason? What is practical reason? And what is judgment? And why are these the tasks of the present? Why is philosophy the task of the bourgeois present? And this, of course, seems to be another advance. Now, in Capital, for the bourgeois thinkers, for the last of them, well, this seems to be yet another advance. Well, you have industry at the command of humanity, totally. Fourier, a socialist, says, well, we finally have the ability to make the seas into lemonade. You don't have to go to a lemonade stand in the city and demand anything of your fellow worker at the spot, but rather rely on the past labor of humanity in turning the seas to a great concoction. And so apparently the bourgeois revolution continues. Marxism might pose something different here, that even as there is this advance, in the modern crisis of nature, we seem to be at the crisis of what is humanity's relation to itself, or as it's put there, what are these social relations, and why are they apparently in crisis? Why does one seem stuck, not as the bourgeois revolutionaries were? Why are people stuck as either subjects or objects in society? And so that same chart could naively be taken purely negatively, that the advance of humanity working upon itself actually simply led to the destruction of its natural capacities. That humanity somehow, this is, maybe you hear this from like anarchists today, like humanity lost the ability to be part of nature. This was the first failure of humanity in the Paleolithic. When it started thinking about the divine and the good, it lost that ability further. That what was enshrined was not the human and its own ends, maybe, but rather simply the arbitrary nature of modern society. And again, with the crisis of civilization, really, there was no possibility of reason. Maybe there is no possibility of reason. So you could take a purely negative approach to all these characteristics. For Marx, though, the question is not to chart some middle course, but it's the question of why are both of these reasonable responses to history in our present? Why are both of these responses to capital both affirming it in the sense of industry must subordinate society and demanding its end, almost like with the Luddites, with the direct damaging of industry? Why are both of these necessary for the present? However, what Marx might pose is that this line, or any variation of such, is not actually the task of the present. Maybe the key task is to understand what it means to relitigate these tasks today. Why would someone take up these past questions? And also, if it is simply a loop there, what is beyond this? Why is this the history that we need to know to understand humanity today? Isn't there another way that humanity could understand itself? And in this, Marx is drawing purely on the utopian socialists prior to him. Isn't it the case that bourgeois civilization pointed to something beyond itself? Didn't it demand the abolition of the government? Why are there now bourgeois governments? To get back to your question on how did freedom as a task collapse? I think comes down to how did, at least maybe for this teaching, how did history become inadequate as a way of understanding the present? Or why would it not be adequate for political ends in the 19th century? And hopefully this piques your interest in the reading group, because in part, this is what all the Marxists attempt to litigate in their time. What is actually possible that points towards the obsolescence of this history? That there could be actual human emancipation from telling this tale endlessly.
Is this model of the crises, is that from Marx, or is that, where did you?
It's from this chart to help think about.
Right, but what's the provenance of that? Is that, did you come up with that, or?
This comes from Chris Catrone's teaching on the same subject, where he drew this. But I can talk about, of course, Marx was a keen student of the Greek thinkers. I don't know if I can point you to any one specific point where this is articulated, maybe the Grundrisse or the 1844 manuscripts in general. But these are things that, to identify these crises, you don't actually particularly need Marx. These are things that you might even encounter in daily life. For example, I know when I was coming to the left, David Graeber was a prominent name. So the crisis of nature was what was on the agenda all the time. The other things might be more obscure, but they're taken up, for example, mostly academically.
This is my first, this is the first time it's ever been articulated to me personally. I've never actually heard of this before. I had a quick couple questions just because I wanted to understand it more deeply. So two big ones. If it were demonstrated that individual tribes developed their own decentralized arbitrary methods, such as those court jesters, does that pose a problem to that system of the crises being developed? Because the crisis would have presented itself before the traditional society actually emerged? And would it suggest that these crises have always existed but were suppressed because of more pressing concerns, or simply by virtue of that own society's decentralization? That's the first question, and then if I'd really like to get a follow-up to that. If you need me to re-explain, I can also.
No, you have time for both of them. I wouldn't take the chart or this explanation as the end-all be-all. I'm not an expert in court dances.
Sure.
But well, you could tell me. I mean, I think that if you engage with any field of study and its history, you encounter similar questions of the relation of history to the tasks of the present. I think the question of have these practices been suppressed might be something that might have more resonance when thinking about the task of the present. Is it that socialism has been suppressed today? But regarding these past epochs, I think we have to take the bourgeois radicals at their word. If we do still think that we live in a society where work earns your pay and you earn your living by interacting with other human beings, I don't think there is any reason to doubt their account of the past. But maybe we can talk about I'll let you ask your question, but maybe we can talk about has socialism been suppressed? what does it mean for a historical task to have lost its moment?
I'll comment on the thing about the suppression of socialism just real quickly, and then I'll ask that other question. That worries me because now I kind of wonder if socialism itself is the court jester. You know, I don't know. So second question. We in these societies earlier, it might have been structurally arbitrary in one sense to have that court jester. But my understanding, was it not the case that there was a merging of knowledge and practice in that exercise? Like the dances for the court jesters, were they not themselves seen as technologists, you know, somewhat arbitrary expressions of aesthetic pursuits, but also self-conceptualized as necessary, right? It's not two separate domains of aesthetics and science. It is a unified domain, right? Is that am I wrong in my understanding of that?
I think this is how bourgeois philosophers thought traditional society thought of itself. That actually there wasn't a relationship of yourself to aesthetics and therefore a relationship of your aesthetics to your technology, but rather you were simply performing in the face of your God according to the people who knew better than you, that you were passing down the great chain of being, as I referenced offhand. That's the sort of key. That actually this distinction between what is and what isn't becomes vital only in modern bourgeois society, and then appears to disintegrate as like even the field like aesthetics versus like you mentioned
Technology.
science. Yeah. Even that distinction in part comes out of the collapse of reason. That if you read, for example, Kant in depth, you'll say, well, isn't there ways in which this like separate critique that he's writing is actually a relitigation of the things that he's talking about in a previous work? This is addressed maybe in like the Karl Korsch that we read on Marxism and philosophy. What is the relationship of all these different disciplines that now exist in the academia to Marxism? Is there like a Marxist version of all of them? Is there a socialist version? And Karl Korsch's maybe most provocative statement is that there isn't like a Marxist version of like art or a Marxist economics, but rather just Marxism. And the reason why this is so is not even anything that is to Marxism's credit or to the credit of the left, but rather that this is just what bourgeois society was doing, that philosophy was religion, that your idea of what it means to have a God to practice in the very early moments of the Enlightenment were questions about what does it mean to be a human being.
Is that an endorsement of that conceptualization of Marxism as like a kind of unifying totalism framework?
I think that is how Marxists view it.
Okay. Interesting.
I had a question. Well, before I would say there was an interesting point that you were raising. Was it repressed freedom from the ancients, or did they have a type of freedom? And I would just go back to some of the modern thinkers you were referencing in your teaching, where there's really a question of what is the relationship that the ancients understood themselves. Is it actually freedom the way that modern society is posing the question of freedom? How is Marxism taking up that question? So I have two sort of quick thoughts regarding that I wanted you to comment on. One, and maybe you can think about this. How do you think the left today relates to the concept of freedom? And not just like the leftists or people that are interested in this discussion, but others. Like, how do you think the left generally today is treating that term? Not just the knee-jerk, oh, we're anti-freedom because it's the right or something, but is there a socialist ethos towards freedom today, or is there not? And the second question I had was more specific to the title of the teach-in, Capital in History. When I look at the graph, it almost feels like everything was leading to capital and it was sort of necessary. But you're not giving a teach-in on the history of capital. So I want to get a sense of what do you think the deeper sense of using or framing this as capital in history? I would just say there's a lot of terms that we don't necessarily. I think you can get this in Marx. I think it was asked earlier, like, where is this graph from? Where I think you do get this, not like it's direct taxonomy per se, but there are things that are taken for granted that actually we're trying to re-express, and I want to get a deeper sense of what that relationship that capital has to the graph, to Marxism, to this question of freedom that you're posing today.
Okay. How does the left relate to freedom today? I mean, I would encourage you to go out and seek that knowledge yourself. But I think it's important to note that the left should not be taken at its worst, that it should be understood genuinely, even when it is rejecting freedom, as the question of, well, isn't it true that there is freedom for the bourgeois thinkers, and then there's freedom for what the left might want? I think there's a very maybe easy conflation of freedom as an ideal, as simply, I think putting it as a rallying cry is too derogatory. I think freedom is taken up as an ideal in the same way that democracy might be, which I referenced after Bonaparte, appears to be something that modern society can guarantee to its own parts. But in guaranteeing freedom or in guaranteeing democracy, the question of society as a whole, this society as fundamentally unaccountable to itself due to what we have to, for the purposes of simplicity, term capital, points to maybe the left's present difficulty in articulating its historical moment. What would it mean to have a stance on freedom as a transformative process, or to actually realize that as a process, or to have democracy in the same sense as the constitution of activity or of thinking in some way? What does it mean to grasp that in a Marxist sense? And I think that many different parts of the left address these in very different ways, so diffuse that at that point you would have to get into individual descriptions. On the second question, which is, why is this capital in history? In some sense, I agree that it does, if you look at the graph that was both handed out and that is on the board now, it does look like, well, first you have one thing, then another, and then capital, and then there's going to be another thing. But I think the key part of that, why I am trying to bring Marx to bear through capital and history, is that capital is itself bringing the history of humanity into crisis, that it is calling for a reconsideration of all these human values that apparently have already occurred. I think that tying this back to what I was saying with the crisis of capital, this is the crisis of humanity. To what ends does, I think, for example, the vast increase in human productive capacity, as represented in industry, also is tied to vast increases in the human capability to think new things. And so capital in history means that the past is both marshaled to apparently the most banal things that are still yet new, that, for example, like would need to go back to Confucianism to understand the Chinese government's next moves in the 5 years ahead. But at the same time, it also points towards how actually, why isn't it that this science of the past, this history, could give a deeper insight into human understanding than history itself could allow? Or why does it appear that today you don't have history as the human science, but the human sciences or the humanities? I think that even this division is something that capital, as the difficulty of understanding and overcoming the present, in reflecting upon the present and trying to change it, manifests itself. I think in that way, touching back on the Marx that I read from the 18th Brumaire, if the point is what points of departure are possible, I think that one has to address this at its most fundamental level, and almost ruthlessly, as Marx would put it, throughout society. But for why it is capital in history, that there is also the difficulty of even articulating what such a critical task would be. That, tying back to your question about the left and freedom, and as I put it, the left and democracy, how could the demand to change human history or to overcome human history be more than a rallying cry or something said at this seminar? Well, what would a leftist project mean to incorporate these fundamental tasks, or to incorporate them as tasks and not as theories behind the words?
Have the tasks of earlier eras been overcome, I guess, in ways that, I mean, has the task of the crisis of nature or the crisis of humanity been overcome the way that maybe the bourgeois crisis hasn't?
I wouldn't even say that the nature of bourgeois civilization has been overcome. If we're thinking about capital as a crisis of bourgeois society, that the ability to objectify and subjectify oneself in society is no longer possible, or seems to become simply about becoming a subject or becoming an object for someone else. I think that the question of what it means for humanity to take that up productively is still in question. It actually motivates some of these utopian designs. What does it mean to say that one has to perfect the human being in order for there to be a rational allocation of, not an allocation of, but a creation of humanity in the present? Comes back to the bourgeois society. I think that our past understanding of the tasks of the past necessarily come to us through the bourgeois revolution because of how capital has not been able to transcend its origin in human industry. That we actually aren't capable of articulating, maybe today, the possibility of what Neolithic or Paleolithic society was like, that it's extrapolation and thought experiments at its best. I think that this isn't something that is fundamental to humanity, or at the very least, the bourgeois philosophers would say that in giving their account of the past, that they were not simply justifying their present, even though it might look that way to us today, but that they were actually opening up a science of the past, that one could actually maybe not study it in the sort of solidified, reified understanding of it today, but actually commune with it, to inhabit the past and bring it to bear upon the present. And I think the way in which that becomes obscured is a reflection of the inability to overcome bourgeois society because of its inability to realize itself in some fundamental way.
When you say overcome bourgeois society, are you referring to like a very fundamental, like structural change? You're talking about like revolution essentially?
Yeah, I think that this comes down to the dictatorship of the proletariat. What does it mean for the working class, which is apparently the most humble, most ineffective, almost the new slaves of modern society, to take up society into its own hands? Now, the point is that there is a difference between the slave revolts of the past, the bourgeois slave revolt, as you brought up earlier, and these proletarians. That the proletarians already are part of society. They're not creating a new society, but that their direction of it could be fundamentally revolutionary, is what Marx would bring to the table. I think that as that relates to overcoming bourgeois society, well, why is it that we have to think about humanity's relationship to itself as simply becoming a subject or an object? Aren't there more productive ways to articulate this? Isn't it even a 200-year-old word too old for us?
Is there a reason that I guess I don't know if Marx says, but is there a reason that it's been conceptualized as fundamentally a different society, or is it merely just the excision of the bourgeois from the same fundamental society?
Can you clarify what you're saying?
Well, I mean, earlier there was the whole thing about like stasis in politics, right? The idea that people were trying to impose what they thought was the best vision of the world onto fundamentally like the same society, right? Was that not the claim from earlier? Or am I missing?
Yeah, I was talking about the Greek conception of politics as stasis, as factional struggle.
Right.
That one entered with their values already given and simply had to win other people over to them.
Right, but then you made the point after that, saying something along the lines of
That,
each political project is made by what we consider the good for the society, something like that.
Oh, I think I said that previously. I was saying that this is how traditional society was seen for the bourgeois philosophers, that it was about the project of understanding the good. But for bourgeois society, politics is about change. It's about how do you actually get compromises done? Why are compromises not the loss of your bloodline, as it might be in Greece, ancient Greece, but actually the change of society in a measured fashion?
To be clear, I'm sorry. It's tough to separate the description from like the prescription. Is there like is the project endorsing that conceptualization, or is it just purely analytic?
I think that given that we are living in bourgeois society and not traditional society, any project of changing society necessarily comes from understanding how society relates to itself, which is through debate and disagreement, at least in part. Now, there are ways this has been criticized, but I think that understanding that basic point is key.
And Nietzsche would really hate that, right?
Maybe. But what would be interesting is what is Nietzsche's relationship to all of this coming in the late 19th century? In a sense, he's coming after not the realization, but the creation of socialism as a political force. And so in part, he's trying to respond to what actually is socialism problematizing in the past. Isn't there like a bourgeois response to this? Can't you actually have the project of freedom? Now, I don't think that Nietzsche is wrong. I think that Nietzsche, imposing the continued necessity of bourgeois thinking in the late 19th century alongside socialism, is actually pointing to what is actually new about socialism that isn't possible in bourgeois philosophy. Not to say that Nietzsche is unoriginal, but that Nietzsche might say nothing that might be necessary for a political project per se.
Yeah, I guess maybe like what is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and is it just bourgeois society without the bourgeoisie, and what is its ultimate aim, I guess?
I think that's a very good question, and I think one has to consider how the understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat has changed for Marxists. Of course, in the Communist Manifesto, it does appear as the progressive government, as the most progressive government, because it is simply led by the working class in some sense. But this seems to now, in the inheritance of 1917, be taken up as some sort of vanguard formation, that there is a consciousness that some people have the ability to express that others do not, that there's some sort of working class sensibility. I don't think that either notion is mistaken, but I think that to talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, maybe most simply, it is about the rule of the working class. So it is not about the end of the bourgeoisie. It is actually possible for the working class to act not as a proletariat, for it to act simply as the manifestation of its changes. I brought this up when talking about the economic formations of the trade unions. Even before Lenin, as I brought up with Marx on Proudhon, the meaning of the trade unions is not the interest of the working class against the exploiters or the capitalists or even their end, but rather how one might sacrifice an economic compulsion to demand a higher wage, to not pay your union dues, in favor of some sort of political association. This is further clarified by Marx writing on the Paris Commune, but I won't go into that. I think that this is noticeable even with just reference to Marx's writings before 1853. It's the question, it's if the working class formulates itself as an organized political force, what would it have to do in society? If it takes up both the unemployed and the employed, if both of these are part of the proletariat, if they are formed into such by some sort of political action in society, if there is some sort of organization that unites them, not even on the basis of economic interest, but maybe political interest, what would an organization that contains all of society have to do if society is split into contending camps? Later in the same response to Proudhon, Marx writes, "The meaning is the creation of the conditions for a civil war." That is the meaning of these associations. That society becomes turned into itself in a way that the bourgeois revolution seems not to give much heed to. That the bourgeois revolutions are all about the nation, the people, the workers, against the dominators, against the people who exploit, or the elite. In that way, the dictatorship of the proletariat is maybe the only place for the working class to clarify what it actually is to itself. What would the working class need to change in society to end unemployment? Would it need to close factories? Would it need to open them? What are the sorts of questions that aren't even imaginable, but which would be simply the order of day, or the matter of course, obvious solutions on obvious questions that we pose by one day of the working class in power? Maybe to put a very polemical point on it.
Chris isn't here, but like to maybe reformulate that question, what's the difference between bourgeois society coming into crisis or contradiction what's the difference between bourgeois society coming into crisis or contradiction and just being exhausted, I guess?
I mentioned this briefly. It's the question of what is discontent in these various forms of society. The bourgeois philosophers say that in traditional society, outside of this slave revolt that Adam Smith describes, there are the slaves who want new masters, and they're simply the slaves who run away into the forests. And so they view their contemporaries similarly. Are you taking up the project of freedom, or are you abandoning it? That is, I think, as I understand it, the exhaustion of that project. Maybe simply is the case that we have developed our utmost science in the year 1819. This is an answer that you could give. The crisis, though, comes in when taking up the project of freedom puts you in collision with those who demand the same thing. That the left and right today, for example, both demand freedom. They both demand that workers control the government. They both demand that the government be honest, accountable, that it be formed of, that it be of and by, that it be by and for the people. The left and right understands the Constitution, and they understand what it means. But in taking up the Constitution, they seem to be opposed to one another. That compromise is now apparently a dirty word in some sense. Or more poignantly and more importantly for Marxism, that the working class, in demanding its share in society, in demanding the employment of its brethren who are simply unemployed, falls into conflict with the people who employ them, the people who are also in society, that they would unemploy fellow members of society, that this becomes a class struggle. This is not even a Marxist point, but one that's evident, that's readily available to most thinkers, that this is maybe indicated as specialization or as necessary. In a way that exhausted projects do not take themselves as requiring the same language, that they simply say that it has been accomplished. But rather, the bourgeois revolution appears to be perpetually unfinished, and so is continually taken up against itself. But isn't really the point to end this ceaseless struggle that seems to have produced nothing? Isn't the meaning to have some emancipation from this constant demand for emancipation?
With our last 10 minutes, maybe we could move back around to the prompt of this teach-in, and I would like to ask, my question is, like, what is Marxism? Like, is it a theory? Is it a way of analyzing history? You said that it's a critique of history, but what does that mean? Is it like a critique of a bourgeois view of history or definition of history? I think that we can say that history is not, a static thing or an objective thing, that it is subjective. As in, like, the way that we view history informs the way that we view the present. Sorry, I'm like rambling. I think I'm losing you a little bit. You just focus on the first part of that.
Yeah, so what is Marxism? I think there are two ways that one has to approach this today, which is, as I put firstly, that really, I'll just put what I said earlier. Platypus does not think that one can simply take up an investigation into the supposed material circumstances of the world. Instead, we have to begin the question of how we came to understand our present, and for what ends. And so Marxism, for Platypus, maybe not exhibited by this teaching, but through its other activities, such as the Platypus Review, which we have plenty of copies of up here. Marxism, for Platypus, is actually one way, in understanding how Marxism is taken up today, it becomes an indicator of how the left is trying to understand its place in history. Is the left taking up an emancipatory project today? How would one even judge that? And I think that leads into the second point of how one might consider Marxism, which is, what is actually motivating this emancipatory politics? Do we know what it is? Do we have the actual resources to actually consider what people are talking about when they talk about Marxism? And that is almost something that's more, that demands some sort of study. But I don't think that these two parts are divorced from one another, and that actually one's investigation or study of Marxism as apparently a philosophy or as some sort of morality for the world, which I don't think is very justifying, might give oneself a better impression, a better understanding of your own interest in understanding the left's emancipatory potential today. And in studying the left today and its taking up of Marxism's questions would help understand what even is new about the left, what could be emancipatory about it, and how would you even bring those ends to, how would you even put pressure on that to actually overcome society in some sense today. On your second point, which is, well, what is the critique of history? Is there a Marxist critique of history? I think that the point is, why are these utopian socialist visions of the future society inadequate for Marxism? It isn't that they're too detailed or not detailed enough or incorrect, but rather that they do not actually keep a keen ear to what is new in society, that they actually are dishonest to society in best representing it, in best representing what it wants, and that in being solidified as a doctrine, it points away from the emancipatory potential of the present. And in that sense, I would understand a critique of history from a Marxist point of view.
For those of you who are new, this is your first teach-in that you've experienced, I want to know what you think. And also, I'm curious, for people who are already in Platypus, has this teach-in changed the way you're thinking about the first week we've done in the reading group in any way? Especially for the Irvine people, I'm curious what you guys think.
I think it was a very valuable experience, actually, because it got me to consider things I hadn't previously thought about in relation to, well, I guess not seriously think about. But when I came in here, I learned quite a bit. I'll have to go back and look at the video recordings, but overall, I think it was a very good talk.
I'll just say, a lot of what I've heard here today was not anything I haven't heard before, but I thought it, but I found it to be as provocative as it usually is when I have heard this, or when these subjects or this way of framing history and framing Marxism and the left and its relationship to history. I'm not sure if anything truly new emerges to me. I think maybe just a lot of old questions that I continue to have and have not thoroughly been able to think through. I definitely will be rewatching the recording. I'll probably share it with a few friends of mine that aren't in Platypus to see if I can get them to have a conversation with me.
I have never heard of that, the crises conceptualization, and this is my first teach-in that I've been in. And I had a lot of thoughts about that, which is very high praise. If it's, I think most things are not, maybe not worth thinking about, but that was a thing that I wanted to think about a lot. I think that it was, you explained it in a very interesting way, so.
All right, let's call it. Thank you so much.